A government can lose power, an election can change leaders, a country can collapse, but corporations can survive through all of it. Because modern corporations are no longer just businesses. They are systems woven directly into everyday life. The phone in your pocket, the apps you use, the food you eat, the stores you shop in, the cloud systems running the internet itself. Increasingly, modern life flows through giant corporations so large that most people barely realize how much power they actually hold. And the most unsettling part, this didn't happen through military conquest. It happened quietly. One service at a time, one merger at a time, one acquisition at a time, until eventually a surprisingly small number of giant companies started controlling enormous portions of modern life underneath the surface. And most people barely noticed the shift happening while it was unfolding, because corporations originally looked harmless, useful even. They made life faster, cheaper, more convenient. And for decades, consumers happily traded dependence for convenience without thinking much about the long-term consequences. But over time, something much larger started forming underneath the global economy. Because corporations no longer simply compete inside markets anymore. Many of them now shape the markets themselves, control infrastructure, collect enormous amounts of personal data, and quietly influence the behavior of billions of people every single day. That's an extraordinary amount of power, especially when concentrated into relatively few hands. And the rise of corporate power didn't happen accidentally. It emerged naturally from modern capitalism itself, because in competitive systems, larger companies often gain enormous advantages over smaller ones. They buy competitors, absorb market share, control supply chains, expand globally. And once companies become large enough, growth itself starts reinforcing their dominance automatically. That creates concentration, where industries slowly become controlled by fewer and fewer major players over time. And once concentration becomes large enough, corporations stop behaving like ordinary businesses. They begin functioning more like private economic governments, because control over infrastructure creates power. And modern corporations increasingly control critical infrastructure almost everywhere. Technology infrastructure, communication infrastructure, retail infrastructure, financial infrastructure, cloud infrastructure. Modern economies increasingly rely on giant corporate systems operating underneath daily life constantly. Most people never think about that dependency until those systems suddenly fail. A social media outage, a payment processing failure, a supply chain disruption. Suddenly, entire portions of modern life stop functioning almost immediately. That dependency reveals how centralized modern economies quietly became underneath the surface. And the internet accelerated this transformation dramatically. Because digital systems naturally reward scale, the bigger platforms become, the more powerful they often get. More users create more data. More data improves algorithms. Better algorithms attract more users. And eventually, giant digital monopolies begin forming around attention itself. Search engines, streaming platforms, online marketplaces, social networks. Everything slowly concentrates into fewer dominant platforms over time. That creates enormous efficiency, but also enormous control. Because once billions of people rely on the same platforms simultaneously, those platforms gain extraordinary influence over society itself. Influence over communication, influence over information, influence over commerce, and perhaps most importantly, influence over attention. Because attention became one of the most valuable resources in the digital economy. The longer people stay engaged, the more advertisements corporations sell, the more data they collect. And eventually, entire business models became optimized around maximizing engagement itself. That's why modern digital platforms increasingly feel psychologically addictive by design. Notifications, infinite scrolling, recommendation algorithms, personalized feeds. Everything became optimized to hold people inside digital ecosystems for as long as possible. And once corporations gain enough data about billions of users, they start understanding human behavior at extraordinary scale. What people buy, what keeps them emotional, what influences decisions, what keeps them engaged. That information became incredibly valuable, because data itself quietly became one of the most powerful assets in the modern world. Phones, apps, searches, purchases, locations, viewing habits, everything creates behavioral information feeding enormous corporate systems constantly. Most people barely think about how much information they voluntarily hand over every single day, because convenience made the exchange feel normal. But over time, corporations accumulated something previous generations of companies never possessed before: mass behavioral intelligence at global scale. That changes power dramatically, because understanding human behavior creates influence, and influence creates control. Meanwhile, governments themselves increasingly became dependent on corporations too. Technology companies provide communication infrastructure. Cloud corporations host government systems. Financial corporations influence markets. Media corporations influence information distribution. That creates an unusual relationship, because governments regulate corporations, but governments also increasingly rely on them simultaneously. And once corporations become large enough economically, they gain enormous political leverage too. Lobbying expands. Political influence expands. Corporate power inside policymaking grows stronger. And eventually, many ordinary people begin feeling like giant corporations influence public life more than voters themselves, especially as corporations grew larger than entire national economies. Some corporations today generate revenues larger than the GDP of entire countries. That's extraordinary concentration of economic power. And yet most people still interact with these corporations primarily as consumers, not as political forces. That makes their influence harder to recognize emotionally, because modern corporate power rarely looks authoritarian on the surface. It looks convenient, comfortable, efficient, fast delivery, cheap entertainment, instant communication. Everything feels optimized for convenience. And that's what makes modern corporate influence so psychologically powerful. People willingly participate in the systems shaping their own behavior, because those systems often feel beneficial individually in the short term. But underneath the convenience, dependence keeps growing quietly over time. And dependence creates vulnerability, because once society becomes deeply dependent on centralized corporate systems, alternatives become increasingly difficult to maintain. Small businesses struggle competing against giant platforms. Local stores disappear, independent media weakens, and eventually entire economies become increasingly centralized around fewer dominant players, controlling larger portions of society itself. That's one reason modern cities increasingly look similar worldwide. The same corporations, the same brands, the same platforms, the same services. Global corporate standardization quietly reshaped culture itself underneath the surface. And perhaps the biggest shift of all is this: corporations no longer only sell products anymore. Increasingly, they sell ecosystems. Phones connected to app stores, streaming tied to subscriptions, retail tied to memberships. Everything increasingly becomes interconnected into controlled environments designed to keep consumers inside long-term ecosystems permanently. That's enormously profitable, because ecosystems create recurring revenue, consumer dependency, and predictable behavior simultaneously. That's why subscriptions exploded across modern life. Software subscriptions, entertainment subscriptions, food delivery subscriptions, storage subscriptions. Even basic digital functionality increasingly requires ongoing payments now. Ownership itself slowly started transforming into access instead, and access creates permanent dependence on corporate systems, continuing indefinitely. That's a massive economic transformation many people barely noticed happening in real time. Because previous generations often purchased products outright. Now modern consumers increasingly rent access continuously instead. Music, movies, software, transportation, even housing itself increasingly shifted toward long-term rental dependency in many cities. That creates stable recurring profits for corporations, but also increasing long-term dependency for consumers. And artificial intelligence may accelerate this concentration even further, because AI systems require enormous amounts of data, infrastructure, computing power, capital, and only the largest corporations currently possess those resources at global scale. That means future technological power may become even more concentrated over time. And perhaps the strangest part of all is that many corporations today possess levels of global influence previous empires could barely imagine. Not through armies, but through infrastructure, data, technology, behavioral influence, and economic dependency. Because modern power increasingly operates through systems people voluntarily participate inside every day. Most people still think of corporations primarily as businesses selling products, but increasingly, giant corporations function more like permanent global systems sitting underneath modern civilization itself. And once systems become large enough, society itself starts organizing around them automatically. Work, communication, entertainment, shopping, transportation, finance, information. Everything increasingly flows through centralized corporate ecosystems now. That changes the structure of modern life profoundly, because concentrated systems tend to centralize power naturally over time. And centralized power tends to keep expanding unless meaningful limits exist to slow it down. That's why corporate concentration matters so much historically, because economic power eventually influences political power, cultural power, technological power, and social behavior simultaneously. And once enough influence concentrates together, entire societies slowly begin revolving around systems controlled by relatively few institutions underneath the surface. Most people still assume governments are the dominant forces shaping society, but increasingly, giant corporations shape enormous portions of modern life just as heavily and sometimes even more directly. And the more dependent society becomes on centralized corporate systems, the harder it becomes to imagine life functioning outside them at all. That may become one of the defining characteristics of the modern world itself. Not simply capitalism, but centralized corporate civilization operating at global scale. And in the next episode, we'll explore another transformation quietly reshaping everyday life underneath the surface. How ownership itself slowly started disappearing from modern society, and why more people are increasingly renting, subscribing, financing, and borrowing access to life itself instead of truly owning the things around them anymore.